Hello everyone, you are watching Inside Scoop and I'm your host Aditi Lamba. Welcome to another edition of this very series of ITV Gold, which presents you prominent South Asian personalities, South Asian advocacies, really bringing forth the voice from our community. Today on the show, it's an honor and privilege to have Lakshmi Sridaran. She is currently the Interim Co-Executive Director for SAALT, South Asian Americans Leading Together, one of the largest non-profit coalitions of South Asian advocacy for immigrant rights, racial justice, and so much more. Today we have her on the show to talk to us about a very current issue and also a very troubling issue for many of the immigrant communities. This Sunday, ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, will be raiding across the nation, finding deportation immigrants and really bringing forth a lot of undocumented immigrants at unrest. We have today Lakshmi talking to us about exactly what's going to happen to these immigrant communities, these undocumented immigrants on Sunday, and exactly what is happening when we talk about immigrant sentiments, when we talk about the immigration policies by the Trump administration. So let's welcome on the show Lakshmi. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. We are really bracing for what's happening this weekend. We know originally the administration threatened to have these mass raids a couple of weeks ago, and so those were postponed originally, and so this is the weekend now that they've chosen to resurface them, and we are doing our best here in Washington, D.C., and like you said, Washington, D.C. has not been listed as one of the 10 cities that will be targeted, although it was on the original list. And so, there have been raids in Washington, D.C. before, and we want to be able to prepare our community members for this weekend.
You know, you are joining us right now from D.C. We are here currently in New York. I have a list of the 10 cities that are going to be targeted this weekend that have been listed as Chicago, Atlanta, Baltimore, Miami. New York is one of them, Denver, even parts of New Jersey. My question to you would be, what do these cities, which have such a high concentration of a diverse community, really represent when these are the ones being targeted by ICE? What sort of sentiments do you think are being presented through this massive raid, according to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this administration is finding as many ways as possible to deport as many individuals as possible. Just yesterday, there was the executive order issued by the president on the census. And, even though the citizenship question was really legally, had no grounds, and that was reinforced by the Supreme Court, he is still finding a way to get that data to be able to target and deport people. And so we see this as one of many tactics to increase the number of people that this administration is able to deport. And really, the foundation for all of this is their ability to really criminalize migrant communities. And that's what we're seeing, and that's what these raids are a part of. And they, of course, are creating both a chilling effect and a lot of fear in communities, and very legitimate fear, because we have seen the mass deportations of so many people.
You know, just talking about these raids, I kind of wanted to bring attention to this press release that SAALT had released very recently, stating that ICE raids announcement comes on the heels of new reports of deaths and overcrowding in detention facilities, denials of beds and sanitation for detained children, and continued unwillingness by ICE to reunify the families. So the big issue here that we're discussing is separation of families, mistreatment to these children, and also not knowing what is happening to these undocumented immigrants who've been living here for so many years. I would love for you to sort of reflect on that. It was a very strong statement released.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the target of the raids that are happening this weekend are not just people that have final orders of removal, but the targets have been expanded to unaccompanied children that have aged out, so essentially turned 18 or older. And so we're seeing, this is, like you said, related to the conditions that people are also facing in detention. I mean, the raids are intended to be able to detain and eventually deport as many people as possible. But this is much connected to the conditions that people who are undocumented or seeking asylum or refugees are facing while they're facing detention for very long periods of time. And so that's another issue that we work very much on, which is conditions in detention. So you're seeing people who, and these are South Asians who are in detention in facilities in El Paso, in California and San Diego, and all across the border that are facing medical neglect, torture and retaliation by ICE officials, by being thrown into solitary confinement, not being provided the language assistance that they are supposed to be guaranteed by law in order to understand their rights, and not being given religious accommodations for what they require. And so these are the range of conditions that we're seeing in detention and that we've repeatedly raised with this administration and really have gotten nowhere. And they are unwilling to address them, and they get away with it every single time.
But then what happens when they add in more of these undocumented immigrants that they want to catch during these raids? What will happen to these community members is my question. And also, just talking about these conditions of immigrants and that have been detained, why is nothing being done to help their situations? We're seeing so many influential personalities visiting detention centers, advocating really highly about things. However, the action has to come from the government. What is your take on that?
Absolutely. I mean, we every time we issue a complaint about a facility, we also follow up with members of Congress that we know are representing those areas where the detention facilities are. And like you said, they have sent delegations to these detention facilities to tour them. And often what happens is when members of Congress go, ICE will sort of clean up and the facility and mask whatever abuses that they're conducting in the facility to present a different kind of image of what's actually going on.
Right.
And it's really bad because ICE has at this point they just don't even care if members of Congress actually see the abuses that are occurring in the facilities, and because they know that there's no recourse. And we've had Senator Harris put in congressional inquiries in California. We've had Representative Escobar and Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who was down there recently.
Right.
And even despite all of that, they are not being held accountable for how they're treating migrants in these facilities.
But as the SAALT press release also stated, this is clearly a violation of certain sanctuary policies that some of these cities already have. What is your take on them being targeted during these raids? How does that sort of impact it, and how should that be targeted now, even through SAALT, when these policies are being totally not being followed?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Many of these cities are sanctuary cities, and I think in some ways that's the reason they are being targeted, because this administration has been going after sanctuary cities for so long, trying to withhold community block grant development programs and other really critical funding from cities that declare themselves sanctuary cities. And so, I think there have been here in Montgomery County, Maryland, in Washington, D.C., government officials have issued statements saying that they will not be cooperating with ICE, and I think it's really important that the cities who have declared themselves sanctuary cities are getting know your rights information out to people, and also making sure that local law enforcement is not collaborating with immigration enforcement. And, it gets really tricky because one of the issues that we've been facing and working with our allies here in Congress is to make sure that the public can really understand the distinction between local law enforcement and immigration enforcement, because a lot of times ICE and other immigration enforcement officials will very much blur the lines deliberately to appear as local law enforcement officials, and so people feel more intimidated and feel the need to have to communicate with them and be arrested. And so that's something that we're also trying to work on, is to make sure that those lines are very clear.
Lakshmi, a quick question just in this regards to you. So are you trying to tell us that the states or perhaps the cities could be protecting these undocumented immigrants, and they need to reach out to these state officials and other areas in their state and the cities to see if there are resources?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think the city and states can and do provide resources, but I do think the most number of resources is coming from national advocacy groups, and most certainly from local advocacy groups who are doing a lot of work. And we're actually hosting a training with our local partner, Justice for Muslims Collective, this evening, and we got an outpouring of response from that community alert that you referenced earlier, for people who want to provide legal assistance. They want to provide language translation and interpretation, and just people power to get as many Know Your Rights resources out this weekend as possible. We had over 500 people sign up on our forum, and I imagine that there's a lot of support like that all over the country, and it's local advocates who I think are really going to make the difference here.
So the national advocacies such as SAALT are right now taking a step to just educate and have these immigrants know their rights, as well as also know how to seek legal help. I would sort of love for you to sort of elaborate on all the other resources available at SAALT for these immigrant communities while they're looking for all these resources.
Absolutely. So we have many resources on our website. We have worked with our partners at Immigrant Defense Project, at United We Dream, and so many other national immigrant justice organizations to be able to utilize the resources they've already created, that if ICE comes to your door and you know, you don't have to answer unless they actually have a warrant, a judicial warrant, and that is that's difficult to decipher in a moment where your door is being banged on and you have to make a quick decision. But these are things that we want to practice and run through tonight at the training to make sure that people feel comfortable exercising their rights. And so what we've done is worked to do our best to try to get as many resources in language. So Hindi, Urdu, Bangla, Punjabi, these are some of the languages that we're focused on making sure resources are available in. And so at our website, SAALT.org, we actually have a link to these resources in different languages.
How much legal aid help do you think an organization such as SAALT would require right now? My question perhaps is for, all these lawyers from our own community that exist around us and all the other, very passionate advocates, what sort of appeal that you would like to say to them on behalf of SAALT, and how much help do you think is really required? Because I think they are going to be a huge, massive force for these immigrants, correct?
Yes, absolutely. I think there's a lot of willingness for people to support right now, and I think it is really going to take every single person. And we are open to taking as many volunteers as possible, and also creating a long-term network of advocates from this outpouring of support that we've received here in the local Washington, D.C. area, because we know that there are the Know Your Rights resources, which are really useful right when the raids and the arrests are happening. But then there's the long-term legal support that's going to be needed when these, the administration is saying they're targeting 2,000 people. So when, 2,000 plus people are getting arrested and detained, there are going to be really long-term legal needs here. And so part of our effort also is to create a long-term South Asian rapid response legal network so that we're able to get attorneys who are culturally competent and can provide, ideally, in language assistance as well, to be able to move people through their cases.
Just on this topic of finding resources for particularly South Asian immigrant population, I'm reminded of 2 years ago when SAALT held one of their conventions, and we had just spoken to Ravi Raghveer through you about the initial incidents of what was happening towards immigrant communities post-2016. Now in 2019, we're talking about big issues that are really in the forefront. We're talking about separation of families that we've seen. We're talking about immigrants dying on the borders. We're talking about our own communities of South Asians that have increased in numbers. Reflecting upon the change in the last few years, Lakshmi, what is your comment on what has happened towards these undocumented immigrant communities, especially when you're talking about South Asians? Could you reflect on how there has been actually an increase in number, and that's why perhaps a lot of us should be worried and support each other?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that question. I do think that in the last 2 years, what this administration has done is actually really fulfill its promise. And so in some ways, it's not surprising that we're seeing, I'll share that over the last 3 years, the number of South Asians, or I should say Indians, apprehended at the border has tripled. And, we're just seeing a huge increase in the number of people who are both being apprehended at the border and also in the interior, and that's specifically in our South Asian community. And we do need better data on more than just Indian Americans, but that's what we have right now. And the number of undocumented Indian immigrants is is over 600,000. And so we are just seeing, this pool of people who are being criminalized and eventually deported just grow in our communities. And so it's really important that in the South Asian community we care about these issues, and that's also why we think it's really important for employers, for the public, for everybody in our community to be prepared, because that's all we have. We have each other, we have our communities, and we really need to strengthen our networks to protect ourselves now.
I have to ask you, when you are talking about the greater South Asian population, Lakshmi, are there certain communities in the South Asian diaspora that you think are currently being targeted more, or you've just seen more numbers in a certain part of the South Asian communities?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's a level of data we don't necessarily have. Based on what we've seen an increase in the number of people seeking asylum from Punjab in India, and we've also seen an increase in people seeking asylum who are from Bangladesh. And so that's kind of what we know, at least with the people who are being detained at border facilities. And then we do know that the number of Indians and Pakistanis who have been arrested in the interior has been over 2,000 in just the last year alone.
You know, I have to ask you, and you can refuse to answer this question because I hadn't sort of added this in our discussions before, but I had actually read a comment made by SAALT on Gurpreet Kaur, the 6-year-old that died at the border. Also from Punjab, and since you had actually mentioned Punjab as a huge part, since a lot of the community from Punjab are the people that you're seeing as being the targets, what was the response of SAALT for Gurpreet Kaur? And the cases that are similar to it, very similar to what we're talking about right now. Could you give us a comment on it?
Yes, absolutely. We did issue a statement following the death of Gurpreet, who was a 7-year-old child from Punjab who was seeking asylum with her mother, and they became separated at some point when her mother went to look for water, because we're talking about temperatures and they were crossing through the U.S.-Mexico border, and so they were in a very remote part of Arizona in the Lukeville areas, where unfortunately her body was found when she died because she was dehydrated, so we issued a statement about that, and we're pursuing that with the Department of Homeland Security to give us more information about whether she actually may have made it to the border and attempted to cross and was turned away. Often what you see is the government blaming these deaths of migrants on smugglers and traffickers, which certainly is a problem in and of itself, but you see that CBP officials, Customs and Border Protection, sometimes are actually turning migrants away when they attempt to cross, and sending them right back into very dangerous conditions that they're dealing with, and can lead to their death, as happened in this case. And it's devastating.
It is very devastating. Do you think there would be any, not a resolution, but do you think there could be a way for us to actually find out what happened, or this is going to be something that would just go on for a while and we may not know?
With Gurpreet specifically?
Yes, yeah, for Gurpreet specifically, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have a pretty good sense of what happened. She was with a larger group of migrant. There were 2 women, her mother and another woman, and then 2 other children. And so her mother, we believe, is still in the country, and the other children and the other migrant mother were also detained, and we don't know exactly where they are right now. And so we're hoping that through them, we'll be able to get more details about what happened. But I think what's more important is that there are just so many stories like this across communities of color and across migrant communities, and certainly within our South Asian community, and just really hope that this really devastating story increases the awareness in the South Asian American community, and the need to really step up right now.
I really thank you for sharing that with us, because I know it's not an easy story for anybody to discuss. It's something that's definitely shocked a huge part of our community. Lakshmi, when we talk about these incidents, and we also talk about what is about to happen this Sunday, we're talking about a huge portion of the South Asian community being affected by these undocumented immigrant attacks. How do you think the rest of us should act? If we were to support an organization such as SAALT, or just advocate more, where is our role now?
Absolutely. I actually think we have an even bigger role to play. Those of us who are documented and who have the privilege of citizenship, I think it's really important right now to be stepping up. And so in addition to providing language assistance and legal support and just, whether you have language expertise or legal expertise, which I actually have neither of those things myself, but what I plan on doing is really being part of the boots on the ground and getting those Know Your Rights resources out to as many people as possible in my local DC community this weekend, and that's what I really encourage everyone to do around the country. And if you're an employer, to really look out for the well-being of course, yourself, but your workers and employees, and to make sure that they also have the resources, because ICE is actually allowed to enter a workplace if the manager or owner gives them permission to do so. So it's really important that they are, they're at the front line of interacting with ICE first when they enter a restaurant or any other establishment. And so I think it's really important for employers to know to not cooperate with ICE and jeopardize their employees. And then finally, I think donating to organizations that are doing this work is really critical too, and something that that our community should really be more involved in.
Lakshmi, I know we're coming towards the close of the interview, but I have to ask you, the community that's at unrest, the community that's feeling the fear, the community that we're talking about that may have just, locked themselves up in their houses right now. I've been reading so many articles about the fact that, the undocumented migrants of this country are so scared that they are just putting themselves in their apartment, in their houses, to just get away from this raid, this upcoming raid. What is your comment to them?
Yeah, I think what that is really related to is the palpable and very legitimate fear that has been created in our communities and in migrant communities and immigrant communities across the country. And so I believe that everybody, has the right to do whatever they need to do to feel safe and to feel protected. And I think it's important for those of us who, don't have to face that fear to really understand that this isn't about panicking. This isn't about unreasonable fear. This is about people really doing what they need to do to survive under an atmosphere that is incredibly threatening, and where this administration has followed through on almost every single one of the promises that they made in 2017. And we've seen the increase in raids and deportations and criminalization and arrests of our community members across the country. And so I think it's really sad to see the chilling effect that these policies have had on our communities, and I think this is just one more example of communities having to protect themselves to survive.
And this comes up right after the Dream and Promise Act that just got passed by the House. I want to discuss sort of your sentiments in regards to the DACA recipients, while we are dealing with these situations as well, because I know SAALT worked massively to get those voices out and to really advocate. And does that impact any of the legislation or any bill that has to do with the Dream and Promise Act?
Yeah, so the Dream and Promise Act is, we're really thrilled to see that was introduced recently and passed, and I know it has to go to the Senate now, and we'll see how far it gets, but it's definitely an issue that impacts the South Asian American community. At SAALT, our focus is on the most marginalized and vulnerable populations within the South Asian community, and so in addition to those who will be impacted by the raid and who are seeking asylum and refugees, those who have DACA status and temporary protected status, which is what the Dream Promise Act addresses, is a really important part of our population. And so we were really thrilled to work very closely with one of our partners, Adhikar, who represents the Nepali-speaking population in New York City, to ensure that these efforts around Dream and TPS could actually be merged into this really powerful piece of legislation that has been introduced. And I think that behind all of that was really tremendous advocacy and unity among those who have Dream and DACA status and those with TPS status that really led to this effort. And so I think this is a really inspiring and powerful example of how communities can come together to really fight for permanent protections, which is what this bill would provide. And we hope that can be extended to more and more vulnerable immigrant populations.
I think the strength in mobilization really works. I really hope, even with this upcoming issue that we're talking about, that SAALT and other coalitions also mobilize. Thank you so much for being with us here on the show, Lakshmi. I would love for you to give One last comment to all our viewers on behalf of SAALT and also on behalf of what is happening in this government, and any comments you would even like to give to the government itself.
Yeah, I think our government, there's so much to say there. I think that it's absolutely atrocious and unacceptable what they're doing to our communities, and this is across communities of color. It's absolutely unacceptable, and I think the message to them is that we are going to keep fighting this effort, and we will do everything that we can to stop both their policies and both their enforcement. And to our community, I really am grateful for the amount of support that we've received in the last year as we've really been building out our body of work on immigrant detention and asylum seekers and just immigration enforcement in general, and making sure that there is just a lot more awareness about this in the South Asian community. And I just encourage those within our community to really understand that that this is a very, very significant issue in our community, and something that unfortunately will probably continue to grow as our community grows and as more and more people are coming from South Asia who are facing these circumstances, and to be really supportive and understand that this is part of a broad spectrum of immigrant justice work that we should all be engaged in. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Lakshmi. We look forward to really showcasing as much support as we can to all advocates that are really fighting for our voices. Thank you so much again for being on the show with us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And that was none other than Lakshmi Sridaran representing SAALT. She is the current interim co-executive director. Do visit SAALT.org to visit more information and connect with us if you have a voice to share. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Aditi Lamba signing off.